Well, we always say the truth is out there. At least that's what they said on the X-Files. There are a lot of us who believe in UFOs, possible alien encounters. In some cases, there are stories of alien abductions. We expect that to be in the southwestern desert, but that also happens apparently right here in Washington State. And so I am grateful to be joined by James Clarkson. He is an author of two books, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also the past director of the Washington State chapter of MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. Jim, really appreciate you joining us. I have to ask you firstly, this list I was looking at says that there have been over 6,800 reports of UFO sightings in Washington state just since 1998. Now, when we're talking about reported sightings, what are we looking at here?
Well, I would assume probably you're basing that on figures from the National UFO Reporting Center.
That's correct.
Okay, anybody can call and make a report. And those reports that have more details, the Peter Davenport, who is the international director and basically does all the work, he will then get people to give him more details. In other words, you're performing a telephonic investigation, getting follow-up, asking them for clarification on where they were, what they were doing, what the weather conditions were, how long the sighting took place. There are numerous questions that you have when you try to really look at all of the details. And bear in mind that when you have a large number of sightings, I discovered this myself empirically. I personally have investigated about 2,000 UFO reports. And what I discovered is actually consistent with what the Air Force discovered, although they're reticent to admit it, and what most other UFO researchers have come to the same conclusion. And this is really very simple. Out of every 10 reported UFOs, there are 2 that you would call true UFOs or gold. Studying UFOs is a lot like panning for gold. It really is. You spend a lot of time sifting the data and sorting it out and talking to people, and people make honest mistakes because many people do not spend any time learning about what is supposed to be in the sky normally. For instance, recently it got way more complicated because of Elon Musk and his SpaceX satellites. That has generated numerous false positives. You have your usual things. I think there's roughly 10,000 artificial objects orbiting the Earth. You have people who misperceive planets, etc. But that, of course, is not what I'm really interested in. What I'm interested in are those 2 out of 10, 20% out of your 6,000, or whatever mass number of sightings, because this really does seem to be pretty consistent. There are going to be several sightings, 3 or 4 out of our 10 that we're talking about, that are man-made or natural phenomena. There are going to be 2 to 3 of them that we never get enough information that we can really say one way or the other what we're looking at. And there are, I'm sorry, I apologize. I got
No, don't even worry about that. We all go through the same thing. Please
Yes.
Go on.
I'm trying to get rid of them. Now my phone is leaving. That will help even more.
That's funny. No, it's the aliens taking control of your phone, right?
It must be. There really are 1 or 2 true UFO cases, and I have a very specific definition for that. That's not just idly stated. That means that I have a highly reliable witness who reports something exceedingly strange that cannot be explained conventionally. And I would say on that definition, based on what I know and what I've found, there is one high quality UFO event somewhere in the world every hour of every day. They just don't all get reported, and they certainly don't get exposed on mainstream media. But that doesn't change the reality. And in the state of Washington and in the Northwest, or I need to include Oregon too, in all fairness, both of these states have a really fascinating UFO history. In fact, whenever I go places, because I love Washington so much, I get to look at them and say, you know, they came here first. And they really did in some ways, although we can take our UFO studies as far back in history as you want to go. We can start talking, ancient times and everything else. But the modern UFO age basically started in 1947. That turns out to be a banner year. And it all centers around the Roswell, New Mexico crash, which happened on the July 4th weekend of 1947. But in Washington State, June 24, 1947, a businessman named Kenneth Arnold, flying a small aircraft from Chehalis, Washington to Yakima in broad daylight, observed 9 crescent-shaped metallic objects flying in formation, and he held them in view long enough that he actually turned his aircraft. He even opened the window on his small plane to make sure that there were no reflections, that he was actually seeing what he thought he was seeing. He was very careful. He timed them, how long it took them to go from one mountain peak to the next. The estimate of speed was about 900 to 1,200 miles an hour. There was nothing that flew then that could fly that fast. This is 1947. This is where one of the great news stories of all time. When he landed in Yakima, he reported what he saw. And a reporter from the East Oregonian newspaper interviewed him and said, well, Mr. Arnold, how did they fly? And Kenneth Arnold was trying to describe this fluttering motion that's almost universally reported by people who have really significant UFO sightings. They fly oddly in the air, probably because they don't fly like our aircraft do. All of our airplanes, no matter how exotic they are or how modern, they are planes. They have to have a certain velocity to ride on the air. And when they turn, they have to bank, everything that we're accustomed to. True UFOs don't have to do that. They're using some other force to stay in the air. Well, he said, well, like you're trying to fly a saucer over the water. And that news reporter had his notebook out and he shortened it up and he created a phrase that ended up catching on like wildfire. And he probably didn't know when he got up that morning that he was inventing a phrase that everybody would recognize from thereafter. Good, bad, and in between. Flying saucer. And we're stuck with everything that goes with that. So, but what a lot of people don't know is that, for instance, within that next week or so after June 24th, UFOs were being seen all over the United States, most especially in the West. And the one that fascinates me the most is that on the July 4th weekend, 5 on-duty police officers in Portland, Oregon, they're all named in the newspaper article, in broad daylight, observed silvery dish-shaped aircraft flying over the city. So, I don't know where they came from. I don't know why they were there. I love to research this stuff. It's I guess you can tell that I get excited about it. I'm very passionate about UFO history because potentially this may change everything about how mankind sees the universe, how we see ourselves on this tiny little speck in the vastness of space. This could be a big game changer if it's ever proven. And I'd like to be the one someday who makes the big discovery. I may not be, I spend a lot of my time doing public education, which I really enjoy. I got my start doing library programs because at the time when I got going doing programs, I was a sergeant with the Aberdeen, Washington Police Department, and my wife was the regional children's librarian for Timberland Regional Libraries. And she said, well, you love UFOs so much, why don't you go do a program in the library? And that opened many, many doors to me. That eventually led me to being in Ocean Shores, Washington, and having a lady approach me who was a pillar of the community. And she was kind of the elderly lady that everybody was afraid of. That was June Crane. And it turned out that when she was a young woman, she worked in top secret laboratories in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And boy, she had a lot to say about the difference between how they talk about UFOs in the public and what they say in private behind closed doors. And that opened my eyes to so many things. And that opened doors to me to lecture about this all across the United States. And actually, at one point, I got to lecture in Paris, which was an extraordinary opportunity.
Well,
But
we are glad to have you right here. And I should point out too, because I neglected to, you are in Port Townsend, correct?
oh yes, I love it up here. We retired in 2018. We moved here for our retirement home. I lived previously to that about 10 years in Olympia, and prior to that, 20 years in Aberdeen, where I was a police officer. I came to Washington State in early 1975, courtesy of Uncle Sam. I was a military policeman. And a young man, you get out of the Army, you start taking tests. And I ended up in Aberdeen as a rookie cop. One of the strangest things, though, that I remember is the way that I heard about the National UFO Reporting Center. I was a plainclothes military policeman. I worked 24-hour duty days. I wore a sport coat, tie. I had a concealed snub-nosed revolver and handcuffs and these special credentials that would get me in almost any door on post. I could demand entry because that we worked to back up the line military police people doing investigations. Well, I'm up there having coffee with the desk sergeant one night, and he's got this big desk. This is at Fort Lewis, Provost Marshal's office, military police. I mean, this is about as formal as you get. There's 4 or 5 telephones on this desk, a big piece of plexiglass, all these pieces of paper and business cards underneath this glass. And I'm up there taking a little break with the sergeant, the desk sergeant, and I look down and I see this business card. And it says National UFO Reporting Center, 206-722-3000. By the way, the number is still the same. And I said, Sarge, what's this? And he looks up with me without batting an eye. And he says, that's where we report UFOs. And I went, wow, that's interesting. And I kind of filed that away. And then he told me about things that he had heard about or seen while he was posted in Europe. And I guess that's the number one thing also that keeps me going with the UFO subject. And I would pass this on to you or anybody else. If you're willing to talk about UFOs, go into a group of people you don't know really well. I don't care where the group is. I don't care who they are. Bring up the subject of UFOs and talk about it long enough that you get past the giggle factor. Because people will make comments about little green men and tinfoil hats and all that kind of stuff. Ignore it. Sooner or later, this is like gravity. One or more people in the group have either had a UFO sighting or an encounter, or they know somebody else that they trust who has. And I guess this is what fascinates me. There is way too much smoke here for there not to be any fire.
You know, Jim, I've always felt the exact same way, which is why when I saw this list, I wanted to get right on it and get in touch with you as somebody who's worked in this field for a long time. And I want to make sure to ask you, and I'll get to June Crane here in a little bit, but is there something about Washington State or the Pacific Northwest that, in your experience, might make it more attractive for UFOs and whomever is flying them?
Well, there are certain locations that are actually hotter than others, but other states in the United States also have similar locations like that. And I will tell you something that is probably a little scary. And I mean this quite seriously. And I don't know what this means. It could be really good or it could be really bad. UFOs and all things nuclear go together like coffee and cream. And I mean that quite seriously. Any location where there are nuclear weapons, where there is a nuclear power plant, or anything else nuclear, if you look, you will find very high quality UFO sightings, up to and including, there are now documented instances, and this sounds like the wildest science fiction, except that I've met two former missile command officers who were there, who actually had the experiences. But over some of our ICBM sites, and I might add, it has also been learned over Russian ICBM sites, there are documented instances of UFOs appearing right over the missile silo. And in our case, there were several events where missiles suddenly went offline. All of the missiles just failed. They could not have been launched. If there had been a full alert, these missiles were offline. In fact, one book has the actual printed out teletype communications, a debate by teletype between the Air Force and the Boeing engineers who built the ICBM system and wired it up. And the Air Force is basically saying, you told us that this system, nobody could interfere with it and that nobody could shut it off unless we wanted it shut off. And they're saying, you know, what you're describing is impossible. It shouldn't have happened, but it did. In the case of the Soviet Union, there was an instance where their ICBMs actually went into launch mode and they couldn't figure out how to get them back offline. And the world probably teetered right on the brink at that moment of having something horrible happen. Now, why did this happen? What is their agenda? I don't pretend to know. It might be benign. Maybe they want to warn us about our use of nuclear weapons. That has been one theory, that the earth is somehow valuable to them. Maybe they want the earth without us on it. I don't know. Or another possibility is they're looking for our weaknesses. They're trying to figure out what kind of defenses they might mount if they wanted to invade. Take your pick. I don't pretend to know what this is all about. I'm not even sure that there is just one kind of visitor. The only thing that I am absolutely convinced of after all these years of study is that the visitors are real. They've been here repeatedly. They are still coming here. I don't know what it means or what it foretells for the future, but yes, indeed, when they came out with that TV hearing in front of Congress about UFOs, or I guess I should go with the new term and call them UAPs. I think this is all out of Madison Avenue rebranding, but yeah, they're real. And they've been operating, especially in Washington State, way before 2004. Now we have Hanford. There are documented UFO sightings, very strange, all the way back to 1945. Another significant event occurred in 1949. I took a report about from a former security guard at Bangor A lot of people don't know that, the reason that the nuclear submarines go in and out of Bangor is that that's where they get their weapons refitted, which means they store nuclear weapons there. Another location for strange UFO events. Peter Davenport has got documented cases that all center around Bangor and Hanford, Eastern Washington. I've had a case from a man whose name I will not reveal. I didn't even tell MUFON who it was, but they determined that this was one of the 10 best cases reported in 2014 from an on-duty federal agent in Vancouver who had a broad daylight observation of a classic UFO over the Columbia River. And he watched it move across the sky, and he's doing the mental checklist. No wings, no jet engines, no propellers. He can see the sun gleaming off of it as it tips. And then he says, but that's not the weird part. And I said, well, what's the weird part? It looked like somebody drew a line in the air, and as the disc passed through it, it wasn't there anymore. Now, was it cloaked, or did it just go somewhere else? Don't know. But while he's standing there with his jaw hanging down, because he can't believe his eyes, here comes an F-15 on afterburners going in the same direction. And it is a fact that the Portland Air National Guard does keep a number of F-15s on a ready-to-go basis, fully armed down there. They are part of the defense of the coastal United States, and they're ready to go all the time. Now, does that prove that this UFO is real? I don't know. What does it take to prove it to you? I've got a federal agent who risks his, and by the way, I met him in person twice. I've seen his credentials. I've even seen his curriculum vitae. He's the real deal. He's what we all hope all the federal agents are. Young, prime of health, very professional, very intelligent, very sensible, a fantastic witness. The report that he wrote for me is certainly as good or better than anything that I could write. And this happened to him. And like many of my best witnesses over the years, after he had his UFO experience, suddenly he wanted me to tell him all about UFOs. And all I can really do is to point him down the same path that I went, which is that I'm all about studying the history. Those are some of my books behind me, some key texts that I've studied over the years. The UFOs and nukes, for instance, Robert Hastings. He spent 40 years now, he's getting to be an old man, interviewing people who have worked at sensitive military sites that are all nuclear in one way or another. And the UFO stories that they relate, they'll leave you scratching your head and wondering what in the heck is going on and why aren't we told about this? Why all the secrecy?
Well, that's a good question. And what do you think? Do you think it's because, as they say, it might cause everybody to go into a panic? Because I think at this point, after talking about Roswell since 1947, if we actually said, hey, yeah, this happened, and we've seen so many movies now that depict it and that sort of thing, that people might take it in stride.
I would hope. I think part of it is old habits die hard, and trying to change an agency policy is like trying to turn an ocean liner. You have to plan it a long time in advance. And they've been doing the same thing for so long, it's really hard to quit doing it. But all the way back in the beginning, people have to remember in 1947, in World War II, for instance, there was no Air Force. The Air Force was born out of the National Security Act that was passed at the end of 1947. Some people have speculated that part of the response may have been because of Roswell and other things, but they formed the United States Air Force, became a separate branch of the service. The CIA was created. out of the OSS from World War II. And they centralized the defense command structure for the United States government. That one piece of legislation is extremely significant. It changed our whole governmental organization. And part of it is here you've got the US Air Force trying to justify their existence and their budget. And the first problem that they get confronted with is that there is something coming and going from our airspace that they can't figure out what it is. They don't know where it's from. They can't stop it. And they're not sure why it's here. That's a heck of a thing to admit if you're a fledgling agency. So I can sort of understand. And then, of course, there's the other deeper agenda, which is if I could capture the wreckage from one of those things, maybe my people could figure out how to operate it, and we would get a big jump on the other guy. So there's another reason for classification. And it's pretty well been proven, and there's way too many details to go in for this discussion. But most of, I think, the alien technology resides in what are called waived, unacknowledged, special access projects with a what they call a bigoted access list, which means these are government contractors involved in retroengineering possible extraterrestrial technology. And the programs they are in are so secret that there is no oversight. And they get to decide who will be read in and who won't. And this was revealed actually by an admiral who at the time was a deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency named Admiral Wilson, who made an inquiry and attempted to contact one of these contractors, and he actually did. And they said, you don't have a need to know. We don't have to talk to you. And it turned out that was true, because when he complained to the people above him, he was basically told, how bad do you want to keep your stars? And how do you feel about your pension? And he kind of decided, well, maybe I'm not that interested in this.
I would say that's probably a motivator.
It is.
Oh my goodness. Well, and let me go
it
ahead. I'm
goes
sorry,
on and
Jim.
on.
Okay. Well, before we run out of time in this Zoom call that we're in, I want to squeeze a couple of things in. So really quickly, short answer on this one. How much of that alien tech you think has been peppered into what we're working with now?
Oh, that I know that question gets asked all the time. I really honestly don't know. I don't believe that everything is done by alien technology. I've had people, that's the Colonel Corso argument. I think that a lot of really good human ingenuity and very talented scientists and engineers have created just about everything that we've got. Did they get a little help here and there? Yeah, it's very possible. And I also think that some of this technology, we still haven't broken it. We don't know. We can't. It's like if you took a cell phone back 200 years ago, you could show it to people and they would go, wow, that's really strange. But there's no technological infrastructure. Nobody knows about microcircuits. Nobody knows how to build them. Nobody knows how to fix them. And that may be what we're confronted with the UFOs.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me, because you're talking about stuff that's very advanced. So the other thing I want to make sure to squeeze in there is let's talk about your books. You've written 2 of them. Let's start with June Crane. Tell me a little, just a quick snippet without giving away the store, so that we motivate people to take a look.
I met her in 1993. And she didn't disclose until 4 years later. She gave me all of her personal papers that proved that she worked at Wright-Patterson. So many details that she has given me ended up being proven one way or another. And basically, she said that they lied to the public about UFOs. That was part of her job, was to type letters to people telling them that they didn't see what they saw, amongst her other duties. She got to hold a piece of the memory metal. She heard stories about where the bodies were kept at Wright-Patterson. She knew many, many things that have been proven out in depth since. And based upon her credibility and my credibility, we know that she was the right person in the right place at the right time to have heard the things that she reports. And I wrote a book because when she was dying, she said, "Tell my story." That was the last thing she told me. So I have a book called Tell My Story, June Crane, the Air Force and UFOs. If anyone's interested in it, you can look at my webpage, which is ufodetective.com, or contact me at ufodetective@hushmail.com. The other book is about the Westport crash. There are a lot of details there. It's a case study. It's about the events of November 28, 1979. At 10:50 p.m., an object was seen coming from on high. There were multiple witnesses who saw it for 40 miles before it crashed in the woods by the Elk River estuary by Westport, Washington. The military showed up. They were evidently already on the way. They blocked the logging roads, and whatever it was, it got taken away. That's the second book in a nutshell. I'm also really interested in talking to anybody who has a significant UFO encounter they would like to discuss in confidence. Most especially, I would like to talk to law enforcement officers, pilots, anybody like that.
Well, we will definitely put the word out. When I post this story on our website, I will link yours to it so people are able to get in touch with you. And in the meantime, such exciting stuff, because I didn't realize until just this very day that there was so much UFO activity. I mean, and I lived in the California desert for a while in the Coachella Valley, which
Oh,
we used to
yeah.
jokingly call UFO country, just
Yes.
because it feels like that's where it should be. But right up here, a lot of stuff is happening too. So that's pretty amazing. James Clarkson, author, a former MUFON Washington State director, and all-around expert on UFOs. Really appreciate that, Jim.
Thank you sincerely. It's a pleasure.